Well, hello, as you can see, I'm in holiday mode, and in fact I'm on holiday. But today I thought I'd put up just a reflection on the Gospel reading for Sunday the 3rd of January, which just happens to be today, so you'll probably be seeing it a bit late. But I wanted simply to get into the rhythm of it again. So we pick up the lectionary reading for today, which is really the last 9 verses of what I'm about to read, but I'm going to start at John chapter 1, verses 1 through to 18. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all through him might believe. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. The glory is of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made it known. Well, as I said, this is the lectionary reading for Sunday, the 3rd of January. I have a good friend. He loves Jesus. He finds God difficult. And I suspect that's probably true of many of us. The Jesus that we encounter in the Gospels is so different from the image of God that we so often, either consciously or subconsciously, carry around with us. I just invite you to reflect for a moment. What kind of feelings are invoked when you hear just simply God mentioned? What do you think of this being? What do you think that it infers it might mean of what attaches to it? So often for many of us, there's an immediate thought of judgment. It brings with it a sense of fear, a sense of always needing to be looking over our shoulders, minding our P's and Q's, making sure that we give a perfect performance every time for fear that we're going to be judged and ultimately punished. I think for many this is what happens when we think of the word God. Jesus, on the other hand, because we read the Gospels and often we don't get that deeply steeped in them, and if we did we might even come into this more deeply, but we are aware of measures of grace, of generosity, of forgiveness, of love. The one who offers new beginnings, the one who offers a fresh start for people. And we see that this comes through again and again as we engage with the Jesus of the Gospels. And so we have this tension between equating the two of Jesus and God being the same? Maybe not. Yet this passage that we read from John 1 gives, I think, probably which is one of the highest pictures of Jesus that we see anywhere in Scriptures. This exposition from the aging John that Jesus is God. The two are inextricably intertwined. You just cannot really that easily separate them. And it imputes to this one who was the Word, this one who came and, as the message puts it, pitched his tent or moved into the neighbourhood. This one as being responsible not just with creative activity for having created everything, but also for sustaining activity. We see the same thought reflected in Paul's teaching in Colossians 1. In verse 15 he says, He, which is Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This passage tells us again that Jesus is like God. He has that same generative and that same sustaining capacity of God. And more than that without him, everything ultimately would fly apart. He holds all things together. John says that. Paul says that. So we're told that Jesus is like God, and yet we have these two pictures, most of us have these two pictures in our minds of two beings that are almost diametrically opposed to one another. In the Gospels, Jesus came to show us what God is like, and yet we still have this disconnect. That God is in some way like Jesus, that we see in Jesus the reflection of the character of God. And so what we are faced with is not a God like Jesus, but to start thinking of God being Christ-like. The God that we worship, we need to actually allow the image of God to be transformed. That we see God is like Jesus. Not Jesus like God, but God is like Jesus. And the things that are important to Jesus, the attitudes that Jesus holds, the ways of relating that belong to Jesus, actually are simply reflections of the character, the nature, the being, and the way of operating of God that we've actually been sold apart. Jesus in this same gospel gives something that I suspect you're going to hear me repeat quite a bit over the next couple of years. It's his mission statement in John chapter 10 verse 10, where he talks about the good shepherd. We can boil it down to this. I've come, says Jesus, that you might have life and have it in all its fullness. That's a reflection of God's desire for us, of God's heart for us. As we launch into 2021, God's purpose for each of us is to experience life and to experience it in its fullness. Not just a kind of half-life, not just kind of living in the shadows, but a life that is rich and full. And it starts from knowing that we are loved. It starts from knowing that we are forgiven, that we are held, and that we are safe. In John chapter 5 verse 19, Jesus says that he only does what he sees the Father doing. Now this is something that I spoke about at my induction. But it's the same basic theme coming through. That God is Christ-like. The sense that as we see Jesus in action, we see God's heart in action. We see God's desires being lived out. And so we see the stories, and I'll just quickly repeat them. We think of the 4 friends who brought a paralyzed man to Jesus to be healed. And Jesus looks at him and he said, "Son," he said, "your sins are forgiven." And it's enough. Although the religious leaders around Jesus are appalled. Only God can forgive sins, they're thinking in their hearts. And it's true. And so Jesus says, so what's easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, take up your bed and walk? So he says to the man, so take up your bed and walk. And the man stands up, he picks up his mat, and off he goes. Now here's the thing. I want to suggest, as I did on that particular day, that this man was already healed. Because the thing that he most needed to hear was that he was forgiven. I want to suggest that it was actually his sense of unworthiness, his sense of sin, his sense of not being enough, which had paralysed him. I've actually seen this before. It just completely stopped him from operating. And so here he was, and he heard the word of forgiveness, and something in him, deep, deep, deep within him, knew that God had spoken to him. And although he hadn't yet realised it, he was able to get up and get on with his life, which he did. Now, Jesus simply responds in the moment to 4 people who bring their friend to him. This is what, as he says, the Father is doing. He's bringing people to him. He's working his way through a crowd, and a woman touches the edge of her garment. She's been bleeding for, I think, 12 years. She's spent all her money on doctors, and nobody's been able to heal her, and she has this idea, if I just touch the edge of his garment, I'll be healed. She does, and she was. And Jesus senses that something significant has gone out from him, power has departed, and he searches around to find out who did it. And of course all the disciples are kind of perplexed. So, well, people are touching you all the time. He says, no, somebody touched me in a special way. And the woman owns up, and he affirms her and her faith. This is what the Father is doing, evoking in this woman a desire, a deep desire to touch and to be healed. We have the story of Bartimaeus, who, as he's sitting against the wall of Jericho, and as Jesus is passing by on his way on his last trip to Jerusalem, he seizes the moment and starts yelling at the top of his lungs, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And above the noise of the crowd, Jesus hears this plaintive cry. It's what the Father is doing. So he stops, calls the man to him, asks him what he wants. He says, I want to see. He is healed, and he follows Jesus along the road. That's what God is doing. The whole sense is that this is invitational. And I will keep suggesting is that God is doing that in each of our lives. For each one of us, I don't believe any longer that there are coincidences, there are God incidences, as I heard expressed this morning, where God brings people into our lives, always opportunities, always invitations to respond, to be an agent of healing, to be an agent of reconciliation, to be an agent of life. Each one of us. And we get to choose yes or no. Each one of us. To follow the way of Jesus as people who respond with generosity, with compassion, with forgiveness, with a desire to see the highest and best in others. Because that is the heart of God. This God that we worship is Christ-like. The things that we see in Jesus are a reflection of who God is. And as we see the generosity, as we see the kindness, as we see the gentleness, as we see the forgiveness and love, as we also see the clarity in calling hypocrites to account, we see a desire for new beginnings and for healing and restoration and for living in the fullness. We see it in Jesus because it's a reflection of who God is. And so as we're heading into 2021, it's my prayer that each of us would have a deeper awareness of the love that is ours, of the grace that is ours, of the intentionality that God has for each of our lives, that each of us are agents of reconciliation, agents of healing, agents of life. not because we should or because we have to, but simply because there's something in us that sees the needs around us, and there's this quiet desire to respond with grace and with generosity and kindness. May this be our gift for 2021. Amen.